This week, it's a Watchman exclusive. Top officials from the Israel Defense Forces join us from the field to share how they're preparing for the threats gathering against Israel and the United States.
I'm standing here and talking to you from a tunnel that had been dug for almost 14 years to attack Israel.
Working with the American allies here, project power over our enemies.
Plus, an Israeli father murdered by terrorists and a son's unlikely and inspiring response. All that and much more only right here on The Watchman. And welcome to The Watchman. The Iranian regime is reeling, and the hits keep on coming. Over the past several weeks, a series of mysterious explosions have rocked sites throughout Iran that are connected to the regime's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. One of the sites targeted a suspected underground ballistic missile factory in the mountains east of Tehran, causing an explosion that lit up the night sky above the Iranian capital. But the biggest and most important strike targeted Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. It's a uranium enrichment site that produces centrifuges that could help to develop a nuclear bomb. Now, experts say that the strike against Natanz set back the Iranian nuclear program by at least several months. And that's a good thing. No one is claiming responsibility for this series of blasts, but the Iranian regime is blaming Israel, and there are concerns that Iran may seek retaliation against the Jewish state either directly or through its proxies like Hezbollah. Folks, Israel is the first line of defense for the free world against these radical forces. And as the threats continue to gather against Israel and the United States, we are bringing you an exclusive on-the-ground briefing this week from top officials of the Israel Defense Forces. It's the kind of cutting-edge information you will not see anywhere else. So let's turn it over right now to Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, International Spokesman of the Israel Defense Forces.
Thank you, Eric. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus. I'm the IDF's International Media Spokesperson. I'm thrilled to be doing this with you, Eric. When you think of it, the IDF is a small military. It's mighty, but it's small, which has to deal with military threats ranging from stones to weapons of mass destruction and everything in between. That calls for a large military, best equipped, and with the best people. And what we'll be able to show you today is an exclusive inside look at the people who lead these efforts. They'll tell you what we're dealing with and how we're dealing with the military threats. And I think that they'll also have a few important things to say about the strength of the bond between us and the United States of America. So without further ado, let's start with our northern border, where there's a brigade commanded by an IDF colonel that defends Israeli civilians against the threats posed by the Iranian-backed proxy Hezbollah in Lebanon. Colonel Roy, it doesn't look as if you're broadcasting from your office. Where exactly are you?
I'm standing here and talking to you from a tunnel that had been dug for almost 14 years to attack Israel. Nasrallah in 2013 had a big and very important speak from his point of view. He declared in that speak that he's going to conquer the Galil. This is part of his plan. A small part that we discovered, part that we worked on it. We caught them, the Hezbollah, with, their pants down. The length of the tunnel is 1.2 kilometers. 14 years, we're talking about a dip of 18 meters. It's like a building with 20 floors that goes down. You can see the floors over here. Everything is authentic. We haven't touched anything. And I think that a photo and a picture says a lot of words.
Thank you, Colonel Rui. It is amazing to see one of those 6 Hezbollah cross-border attack tunnels that you and your men exposed and destroyed, making sure that Israeli civilians are safer. Now, we all know that this amazing military achievement probably wouldn't have happened had it not been for the joint Israeli-American technology that allows us to see and locate tunnels exactly where they are. By the way, we are the only 2 militaries in the world who possess this specific battle-proven technology. Now, let's go big, let's go strategic, and let's hear from the commanding general responsible for planning and executing many of Israeli activities that you in the audience probably have heard about only in the media, and a general who deals with the biggest and most serious strategic threats that the state of Israel faces. Major General Tal Kalman, how are you, sir?
The main issue that is concerning us, although we're dealing with this nowadays, is the Iranian issue. Iran is daily making many efforts to build proxy military capabilities and try to bring them as close as she can to Israel's borders, trying to build ballistic capabilities, long-range ballistic capabilities that threat Israel. But they don't only threat Israel, they threat other countries and maybe even Western countries. And obviously striving towards a nuclear weapon. Our strategy is, together with the United States, first of all, maximum pressure campaign on all domains against this regime, trying to change its behavior, and at the same time building our capabilities against these proxies. The past few years we've developed a method of what we call the campaign between wars, meaning that we are not waiting in Israel's borders, letting these proxies build their capabilities and going out to war whenever it happens, but actively, almost daily, acting against these capabilities being built and doing this under the threshold of war. And actually we've had very high success with this campaign between wars the past few years, and Iran is far, very far from its capabilities, doesn't have the amount of ammunition she planned, the amount of personnel and capabilities in the proxies around us, but we understand that this is a long fight that we still need to fight, and we're dealing with it daily. The main proxy which is challenging us the past few years is Hezbollah. Hezbollah has thousands of rockets aimed at Israel, and the past few years has been building what we call PGMs, which is precise guided missiles. These missiles threat Israel because Israel is a small country, has a few strategic targets, and this is a threat that we are not prepared to live with. And our strategy against this is obviously, first of all, maximum pressure campaign against Hezbollah, and financial pressure on the Lebanese government, which is responsible for Hezbollah acting in its territory, and other military methods that I can't talk about all of them, but what I want to say is that Israel will not let Hezbollah build massive amounts of PGMs on their ground.
Thank you, Major General Kelman, head of the IDF Strategic Directorate. Now, we all know that the IDF is known to be and perceived as a very strong military in the Middle East. We also know that the IDF and the US Armed Forces, the different services and branches, we train together, plan together, and we even share intelligence. Let's go to the base commander of the Nevatim Air Force Base down in the extreme south of Israel to see firsthand the commander of that base. Good evening to you, General.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good evening to all our friends in Kufi. My name is Omer Tischler. I'm a fighter pilot and the commander of Nevatim Air Force Base, from which we operate our 2 F-35 squadron here in Israel. I'd like to say a few words about our deep cooperation with the joint American forces. Over the last year, we have a few very important exercises, specifically aerial exercises, with the joint American forces. One of them is the blue flag. We had another one is the Juniper Cobra, and a third very important exercise was the Enduring Lightning. Those exercises helps us better understand the capabilities and the superiority of the F-35. But more than that, we operate here in the Middle East. This is the true operational arena. Working with the American allies here project power over our enemies. I believe, my opinion is that our enemies don't really understand what we do. They don't see what we do, but they see that we are working together as partners, allies, and that project power. It is part of our national security. The idea is not just an aircraft. The idea helps us have better capabilities with regards to national security aspects. As you may know, we already operate with the F-35 in the operational arena. This information is shared with our allies, with one ally, with the American joint forces. Sharing that information, those capabilities, the very operational sensitive information, show how deep is our cooperation and trust that is based on shared values.
Thanks again to the Israel Defense Forces for that exclusive briefing. Up next, we're staying with Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus to learn about one of the greatest threats facing Israel and the Middle East today. It's all about precision. Find out what I mean after the break. Don't move.
Jerusalem is the city that God has chosen as His dwelling place forever. This month, we want to remind you of your role as a watchman on the walls of Jerusalem with a beautiful piece of artwork, free, with your gift of any amount. This stunning painting was designed by one of Israel's premier artists. It features the city of Jerusalem along with powerful words from the prophet Isaiah. With your gift of any amount, you'll receive this one-of-a-kind painting suitable for framing and a daily reminder of your role as a watchman on the walls of Jerusalem. Visit www.kufi.org/give to receive your exclusive painting for a gift of any amount while supplies last. And join Kufi to add your voice to a movement of over 8 million Christians speaking out for Zion's sake.
Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us. There is so much to talk about, but let's start with Iran. Why is it so crucial that Iran and Hezbollah do not establish a foothold on the Golan Heights near Israel's border? And how is the Assad regime in Syria helping them?
Let's zoom out a bit and think about what Iran is trying to achieve. They have spent billions of dollars over many years in trying to bridge one big challenge that they have. The big challenge is that Iran is over here and Israel is here, and they're trying to gap more than 600 miles of a distance. Now, they've got two ways in which they do that. One is by using proxy organizations like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Islamic Jihad in Gaza. And the other way is by forwarding military capabilities from Iran into Syria and then trying to attack Israel using either Syria as a launch pad or Lebanon as a launch pad. Now, I'm sure that you know and remember very well, but I don't know if everybody in the crowd remembers that Iran has already tried and attacked Israel 6 times in the last 2 years. All of those attacks came from Syria, which also means that the Assad regime is responsible for those attacks. All of those attacks were thwarted by the IDF. Fortunately, there were no casualties and no substantial damage. And as you also know, every time they attacked us, we made sure to retaliate in kind and make sure that they get the message that attacking Israel from Syria is an exercise in futility, and that we won't allow the Iranians to establish themselves militarily in Syria and to open up a second front in the north against Israel. And it's absolutely important that the world and the free countries in the world understand that we won't tolerate an additional Iranian front against Israel. It's bad enough to have Hezbollah controlling Lebanon, using and abusing civilian facilities in Lebanon in order to attack Israel, and it won't be allowed to happen on the Syrian Golan Heights either. And I can assure you, and this has been said by our Prime Minister and by the Chief of the General Staff more than once, we will take whatever steps necessary to negate these threats against Israel, be it kinetic, non-kinetic, and everything else needed.
Jonathan, tell us why these precision-guided munitions, or PGMs, would be a potential game changer if Hezbollah got its hands on them. And tell us a bit more, if you can, about Hezbollah's overall capabilities.
So PGMs, or precision-guided munitions, are basically advanced rockets. What they mean is that if you have an old rocket, which you place in a location, you aim it, and then you fire it, you can't really control it in mid-air, and the chances of actually hitting your intended target are statistic. And in order to actually hit the target, you have to fire many rockets if you're a terrorist. The big difference with PGMs are that you can fire them and you steer them in flight, and they have a target area of about 150 feet. Now imagine a terrorist organization like Hezbollah having the ability to strike almost pinpoint accuracy any target in Israel. Imagine utilities, imagine ports, airports, imagine our symbols of state, and imagine the most sensitive areas in Israel, all within range and all within capacity of Hezbollah to attack. That is why we are so adamant about the fact that this is a strategic threat against Israel, and as General Kelman told us about before, it's something that we're operating day and night using our excellent intelligence and using our Air Force and other assets that we have at our disposal to negate and make sure that this will not actually turn into a threat that will menace Israeli civilians and endanger our economy and our most sensitive facilities.
Folks, be sure to check out Lieutenant Colonel Conricus' updates on Twitter at LTC Jonathan. Well, coming up after the break, a father murdered by terrorists, a son devastated. What came next will inspire you. Do not move.
Anti-Semitism, the world's oldest form of hatred, is growing in the United States and around the world. As Christians, we have a sacred duty to stand up and speak out against this dangerous trend. CUFI's new ebook, The War Against the Jews, follows the ancient thread of anti-Semitism, from Haman to Hitler to Hezbollah. With this free ebook, you'll learn the history of this dark hatred and how it often operates today under the guise of activism and social justice. You'll also discover what the Bible says about those who hate the Jewish people and the consequences for those who practice anti-Semitism. Visit www.cufi.org/ebook to receive your free ebook today. And join CUFI to add your voice to a movement of over 8 million Christians defending Israel and combating anti-Semitism.
And welcome back. CUFI's Israel Collective makes incredible short films that show the true heart of the Israeli people. It's a heart that's been broken so many times over the years due to constant terror and war waged upon the Jewish state. But as the next story shows, a broken heart can sometimes lead to a heart restored. Take a look.
My mother called and I answered the phone. She said, there's been this horrific terror attack in Jerusalem, and it was on a bus, and I've been calling your father for 10 minutes and he's not answering, and I know he was in the area. My father, Richard Lakin, was a kind, gentle man. He was a person who dedicated his life to education, to educating children, to teaching them to love and to respect. He had been on a bus 78 in Jerusalem, and two men had boarded the bus, two terrorists, and at a certain point, one of them stood up with a gun and started shooting people, and the other one stood up with a knife and started stabbing people. And he was shot in the head, along with two other men. And after he fell to the ground, they started stabbing him. He was stabbed everywhere. It was horrific, in the head, in the face, in the chest. The knife actually broke while it was inside of him. The damage was just beyond repair. And eventually his body couldn't hold out after 2 weeks, and he died in front of us. Horrific as it is, one of the terrorists who was shot by the police while in the act of stabbing my father was brought into the intensive care unconscious with my father, and he was treated 3 beds away from him by the same medical teams, and he survived. I actually watched him regain consciousness, and he opened his eyes. I had a very brief moment of anger for 2 or 3 minutes. All of the rest of the time, I was overcome with the feeling that you have to make something positive out of this. This is what my father, this is what he lived for, this is how he behaved naturally, this is how he educated me and my family, and my mother educated us. The Palestinian Boy Scouts, or the Palestinian Scouts Association, recently renamed their Scout Leadership Program after Ba Aliyan, the terrorist who shot my father on the bus, because they, as they stated and they put on their webpage of the Palestinian Scouts Association, that this is the kind of leader we want you to become, and you should be a martyr like Ba Aliyan. I think if my father would have seen all of this, this is what he would have focused on, is how children are being educated. They need to be educated to love and not to hate. When you look at it, there's nothing to be gained from hating. People who hate, it just creates anger within, and it just eats them from within. And people who love feel good themselves. What seems to me the right thing to do, also in his memory, but also just because that's how he educated me, is to bring people's attention to this. Because if people aren't educating towards love on their own, then they need help from the outside to get there. My name is Micah Avni. I'm an Israeli, and I choose love.
That's powerful stuff. If you want to see more of the Israel Collective short films, be sure to visit the URL that you see there on your screen. Folks, it was great having those top officials from the Israel Defense Forces on the show this week because, as they alluded to in their interviews, there is a major conflict coming in the Middle East. I call it the Great Northern War. Israel is headed for a showdown with the enemies to the north. I'm talking about the Iranian regime, Hezbollah, and various radical proxies in Syria and Lebanon. It's a war that may spill over to the broader Middle East and affect you no matter where you live. Israel cannot accept the Iranian regime and Hezbollah continuing to stockpile lethal weapons at Israel's borders and with deadly intent to wipe the state of Israel off the map. Here's the good news. Number one, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, neither slumbers nor sleeps. And Psalm 37 says that he sees the plots of the wicked and he laughs. Number two, Christians United for Israel, America's largest pro-Israel organization with 8.5 million members, is standing shoulder to shoulder with Israel and the Jewish people in the face of these threats for such a time as this. You see the information there on your screen. Call or click and join our movement today. Thanks for joining us this week on The Watchman. Until next time, God bless you. And remember, never hold your peace.